I arrived at the Ashford estate in Greenwich with a sense of déjà vu, like I had been here before, but every detail was slightly off. The mansion was a sprawling colonial masterpiece, white pillars rising like sentinels, gardens meticulously trimmed, fountains glinting in the afternoon sun. But for all its beauty, the place was suffocating in its opulence, and I felt like an intruder. I wasn't a stranger to wealth. I'd built my life from the ground up, scraping and sweating. But this world, this rarefied air of old money and inherited titles, it wasn't mine. And apparently it wasn't mine to touch either. I had come for my daughter's wedding. Victoria, my only child, and for the past 26 years, my pride, my joy, and my reason for enduring every hardship. She was radiant in her gown, walking gracefully down the aisle with a smile I had nurtured since she was a child. But there was a lie behind that smile, a shadow hanging over the ceremony that I couldn't ignore. Victoria had told everyone I was gone, dead. My daughter had replaced me with a stranger, a man she called her father, and there I was, sitting at table 18, invisible to everyone around me. I wore a tuxedo borrowed from my best friend. It fit, but it wasn't tailor-made. My shoes were polished but scuffed at the edges. Compare that to the glittering designer shoes, silk gowns, and sparkling cufflinks around me. The contrast was stark, and I could feel it in every sideways glance and whispered word I caught from the guests. They didn't see me. They saw a man who clearly didn't belong in this rarefied air. I suppose in many ways they were right. I wasn't part of this world. I had earned my wealth through grit, not inheritance, and somehow that seemed invisible here. Victoria's so-called father, Richard Morrison, sat at the head table, puffed with importance, smiling and nodding to the crowd as though he had raised her from birth. Every word he spoke in her praise made my blood boil. He had never wiped her tears, never held her hand through late-night fevers, never saved every penny to pay for her ballet lessons, her piano recitals, or her college tuition. Yet here he was, basking in the glory that should have been mine, pretending to be the man who had sacrificed everything for her. As I observed the room, I couldn't help but notice the meticulous details. The Ashford estate wasn't just a home. It was a showcase. Every flower, every crystal vase, every golden ribbon was perfect. The caterers moved like clockwork, servers gliding silently with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The lighting highlighted the elegance of the grand hall, while a string quartet played softly in the corner, serenading a room that could easily have been a museum for the ultra-wealthy. And yet, despite the grandeur, despite the perfection, it all felt hollow, like a stage set without meaning. Because behind it all, the truth was hidden. The real father, the man who had built the life behind Victoria's smiles, was seated quietly, unnoticed, invisible to those who had no right to stand in judgment. I watched as the guests laughed and clinked glasses. Margaret Henderson, the art dealer from the Upper East Side, whispered to Dr. Walsh, the retired cardiologist, about how impressive the wedding was. Every word, every gesture, was a reminder that appearances mattered far more than reality in this world. And my daughter, my Victoria, had bought into it completely. She had chosen a world of facades over the father who had given her everything. And now, I had to sit back and witness it. Yet I was not powerless. I knew every contract, every payment, every hidden detail of this wedding. From the catering to the florists, every penny had passed through my hands. Every lavish expense had been covered by me, every meticulous plan executed by the sweat of my labor. They may have laughed at my borrowed tux, scoffed at my humble shoes, but I held the real power quietly in my pocket, unseen and underestimated. And as the champagne flowed and laughter echoed through the grand hall, I made a silent promise. This farce could not continue unchallenged. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. She was nervous. I could see it. Yet she tried so hard to play the part of the grateful daughter, the charming bride adored by all. She had practiced this performance for months, perfecting the act of filial gratitude toward a man who had no part in her life. But I saw through it. I had always seen through it. I had raised her with honesty, with integrity, teaching her the value of hard work, respect, and truth. And now, In this room filled with laughter, wealth, and lies, I felt the tension in my chest, the weight of what I was about to do, what I had been waiting 26 years to accomplish. Every guest, every whisper, every sideways glance, it all set the stage. I had to be careful. I had to be precise. One wrong move and Victoria, and the strangers she had called her family, would laugh in my face. But I had the truth, the final check, the contracts, the evidence. And I knew that in the right moment, everything would unravel, the facades would fall, and the room would remember the father they had ignored, the man who had built the life they now celebrated as if it were someone else's doing. For now, I sat quietly at table 18, invisible to the eyes that mattered, but fully aware of the stage, the players, and the story that was about to unfold. The invisible father was here, and soon, everyone would know that invisibility does not mean impotence. The price of a dream wedding. The wedding, from the outside, was the picture of perfection. Guests had flown in from Los Angeles, New York, London, even Paris. The invitations had been embossed in gold, the menus printed on silk paper, and the seating arrangements had been meticulously orchestrated to ensure maximum social optics. Every detail screamed wealth, power, and influence. But beneath that polished veneer, every glittering element came at a price far greater than anyone could imagine. I had seen the invoices, signed the checks, and endured countless negotiations behind the scenes. The flowers alone, imported roses, orchids, and lilies from 3 continents, had cost more than most people's monthly rent. The catering was a feat of engineering, with chefs flown in from Michelin-starred restaurants, each dish planned to the last microgram to impress. The wine list rivaled that of the finest 5-star restaurants, with bottles that could fund a small startup. And yet, none of this extravagance belonged to the people celebrating. My money had paid for it all. Victoria didn't know the half of it. She thought this day was about appearances, about proving herself to her new world of affluent in-laws. She had told me, weeks before the wedding, how important it was that everything be perfect, that she be the center of attention, that her husband's family approve of her choices. And I had smiled, concealed the truth, and watched as she meticulously micromanaged every element, not realizing that every aspect of her dream had already been made possible by me. The irony was delicious in a bitter sort of way. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the estate's manicured lawns, the reality of the cost became almost tangible. Security alone had required a full team of professionals, bodyguards, plainclothes officers, surveillance experts, to monitor every guest and ensure no uninvited intruder would disrupt the spectacle. There were rental tents large enough to host a small army, air-conditioned and soundproofed, with floors polished to a mirror shine. The chandeliers alone, rented from a luxury supplier in Manhattan, cost more than a modest car. And all of it was silent testimony to the fact that in this world, appearances were everything. Guests, of course, were oblivious. They laughed at the servers, complimented the music, and marveled at the decor. No one knew that each perfectly placed rose had been meticulously inspected by my team for flaws, that the lighting engineer had adjusted every bulb for maximum visual effect, or that I had personally ensured the caterers wouldn't serve anything less than perfect. They saw the result, but not the painstaking labor behind it. And that labor was mine. Every penny, every minute, every drop of sweat had flowed from me to make this dream a reality for people who would never truly acknowledge me. I glanced across the hall at Richard Morrison. He was congratulating a cousin of his new family, laughing with exaggerated charm. He had orchestrated nothing, planned nothing, and yet he acted as though he were the architect of this magnificent day. Meanwhile, Victoria's mother, my ex-wife, smiled nervously, caught between maintaining her composure and realizing, perhaps subconsciously, that the grandeur around her was funded by a man she had dismissed years ago. The irony was exquisite, and yet, as I watched them, I felt the weight of responsibility. Money could buy flowers, wine, security, and lighting, but it could not buy respect, love, or authenticity. I had given Victoria everything, and yet, her world was built on illusions. The bride's smile, so polished and rehearsed, was brittle, like porcelain ready to shatter under pressure. Every compliment she received, every admiring glance, was a lie she and the guests willingly perpetuated. They valued the spectacle more than the man behind it, the real father who had made this entire illusion possible. The cost of a dream wedding, I realized, was more than money. It was compromise. It was bending reality to fit someone else's vision. It was forcing yourself to play a role for the approval of people who had no right to judge. Victoria had paid this price emotionally, seeking validation from strangers instead of recognizing the unwavering support of the man who had truly given her everything. She didn't understand that a true father's love could never be measured in dollars, but in sacrifices unnoticed and efforts unseen. As the music swelled and the first guests began to take their seats for the ceremony, I could feel the tension building. I had spent months ensuring every detail was perfect, not for their approval, but for the moment when the truth would emerge. The beauty, the grandeur, the expense. All of it had set the stage for a revelation that would leave no doubt about who had truly built this life, and who had merely stepped into the spotlight to take credit. I took a deep breath and studied the guests around me. They were laughing, taking selfies, exchanging pleasantries, blind to the truth beneath their feet. They thought this day was about Victoria and Richard. They didn't see me, but I saw everything. I had planned every contingency, every twist, and now, as the ceremony approached, I was ready. The price of the wedding wasn't just in dollars. It was in patience, precision, and timing. Every detail mattered, because one misstep could ruin the reveal. But I was ready. Victoria, radiant in her gown, floated down the aisle, blissfully unaware that her world was about to change. She had spent years imagining this day as a perfect fairy tale. She had imagined admiration, applause, and approval, and now she was about to witness the cost. Not in money, but in truth. The lavish setting, the hundreds of guests, the grandeur she had dreamed of. All of it was mine, funded, arranged, and orchestrated by the very father she had replaced. And as the ceremony began, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The price of a dream wedding is steep, I thought, but nothing compares to the value of revealing the truth. The bride's first mistake. Victoria had always had an instinct for drama, the kind of instinct that transforms simple moments into performances worthy of an audience. But on her wedding day, that instinct betrayed her. It started innocuously, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in a mirror that would eventually shatter the entire reflection. I watched closely, sipping my drink at the edge of the grand hall, noticing every micro-expression, every subtle twitch of impatience or irritation. In that moment, I realized that her first mistake wasn't loud, it wasn't bold. It was quiet, careless, and entirely avoidable. The ceremony had begun as expected. Guests murmured in admiration. The string quartet played their flawless rendition of the classical pieces she had personally selected, and the sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the marble floor. Victoria floated down the aisle, radiant, holding her bouquet with the precision of someone who had spent weeks memorizing posture and angles. Every eye was on her, and yet, even in the midst of perfection, she faltered. It was the way she treated me, subtle yet unmistakable. As I approached to offer a congratulatory word, she recoiled, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Oh, hi," she said, her voice laced with condescension, though practiced enough to hide its true edge. A small slip, yes, but enough to ignite a spark that would grow into an inferno later. She had assumed, perhaps, that on this day I would play the background role, invisible, powerless, a shadow in the corner. She underestimated me, and that would become the foundation of her first mistake. Throughout the reception, the missteps continued, like a series of small stones leading to a landslide. She issued orders to the staff as though she owned the estate, demanding last-minute adjustments to flower arrangements, table settings, and even the lighting. Every request was minor on its own, but cumulatively, they revealed a lack of awareness, a blind arrogance that ignored the effort and resources already invested. What she didn't realize was that every lavish detail, every exquisite touch, was funded, organized, and perfected by me. She assumed it was her world. In reality, it was mine, and she had no comprehension of the extent. Then came the public slight. During the speeches, a cousin of hers, a distant relative she barely knew, raised a toast, praising the effortless elegance of the event and, perhaps unintentionally, highlighting the work of the family. Victoria's lips tightened, and her eyes flicked toward me as if daring me to acknowledge her displeasure. She failed to recognize the subtle irony. Every aspect she praised was mine. Her gratitude, misdirected and shallow, only fueled a quiet, burning amusement within me. This was the moment her first mistake fully took shape. She believed she could command admiration without understanding or acknowledging its true source. The interactions with guests compounded the problem. She moved from table to table, chatting superficially, smiling for cameras, and posing for photos, all while maintaining an air of superiority. She corrected minor dress details, adjusted hair, and whispered criticisms under her breath. Each small action, unnoticed by the guests, was a thread in the unraveling tapestry. She was too absorbed in her image, in controlling perceptions, to notice the reality unfolding around her. And reality, in this case, had a single witness: me. Every slight, every misjudged word, every carefully hidden eye roll was noted, catalogued, and stored for later use. The final catalyst for her first mistake came during a seemingly innocuous moment: the unveiling of the cake. The wedding planner had orchestrated a perfect reveal, a tiered masterpiece adorned with delicate sugar flowers and shimmering gold leaf. Victoria, however, refused to simply admire it. She stepped forward, inspecting the icing with a critical eye, her hand hovering over the delicate frosting, as though she could command perfection with a gesture. "It's nice, I suppose," she said, her tone dismissive. Gasps echoed around the hall. Guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or intervene. She had crossed a line. In trying to assert authority, she exposed her ignorance and impatience to everyone present. And in that moment, I knew the first mistake had been made. It wasn't just a matter of pride or entitlement. It was a crack in the foundation of her carefully constructed world. She had misjudged the situation, overestimated her control, and underestimated the presence of someone who had truly built the stage she now danced upon. The day was still young, the ceremony ongoing, but the seeds of chaos had been planted. Every word she had spoken, every movement she had made, would soon become evidence of a disconnect between perception and reality. I leaned back, observing the subtle ripple of tension spreading among the staff, the faint unease in some of the more perceptive guests, and the barely restrained smirk of the photographer, who seemed to sense the underlying drama. Victoria, radiant yet oblivious, continued her performance, unaware that the day had already shifted. The first mistake, as minor as it seemed, was a critical turning point. She had stepped onto a stage she didn't fully understand, surrounded by players she believed she could control, and had begun to lose her footing. The brilliance of this moment, from my perspective, was in its inevitability. Every action she took, every slip of awareness, would compound into a perfect storm of revelation. The first mistake was not loud. It didn't crash like thunder. It was quiet, subtle, and elegant in its failure, like a single note played slightly off-key in a symphony. And I, positioned perfectly to observe it all, knew that from this minor misstep, a cascade of consequences would follow. By the time the reception continued into the evening, I could see the tension growing in the shadows. Victoria's first mistake had set the stage. The day's grandeur, the hundreds of guests, the flawless execution of every detail, it was all a stage for what was coming. And I was ready. Her ignorance, arrogance, and miscalculated pride would be her undoing, and the first mistake was merely the opening act. The real performance had yet to begin. The silent observation. From the very first moment Victoria began her reign over the wedding, I decided to take a step back. Not out of fear or hesitation, but as a strategic measure. Observation is a subtle art, one that few truly master, yet I had spent years honing it in both my personal and professional life. I knew that in order to dismantle the facade she had so carefully constructed, I had to understand it fully, every nuance, every instinct, every concealed motive. And so, I became the silent observer. The grand hall buzzed with excitement, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Yet in the midst of this chaos, my attention was entirely focused. I didn't need to speak. Words would have betrayed my purpose. Instead, I moved like a shadow along the perimeter of the event, watching, cataloging, and analyzing. Every guest, every interaction, every subtle glance from Victoria was a piece of the puzzle. Her body language spoke volumes. The faint tilt of her chin, the calculated positioning of her hands, the almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. These were the details she thought went unnoticed, but I saw them all. Guests often fail to notice what is happening right in front of them when dazzled by grandeur. Victoria thrived on this distraction. Her radiant smile, designer gown, and meticulous attention to aesthetic details captured every camera lens. But my gaze was not fooled by appearances. I focused on the undercurrents, the unspoken tensions, the fleeting discomfort, the subtle micro-expressions that betrayed authentic emotion. While the world saw a picture-perfect bride, I saw someone teetering on the edge of arrogance and insecurity, trying desperately to maintain control over a world she did not fully understand. The staff became my secondary focus. These individuals, trained to serve without being noticed, often reveal more than the guests do. I watched how they responded to Victoria's commands, how the servers' hands trembled ever so slightly as they adjusted floral arrangements, how the lighting technician cast wary glances toward her. Every minor stress point became part of the intricate map I was drawing in my mind. The more I observed, the more the true structure of the day unfolded, like a blueprint revealing hidden weaknesses beneath the polished surface. I also observed the subtle alliances forming among the guests. Weddings, especially grand ones, are social laboratories, where people instinctively group themselves by status, familiarity, or shared interests. Victoria had assumed that the family she hired, the so-called wealthy California elites she presented to the guests, would dominate social interactions. Yet even in their curated performances, cracks appeared. Overheard conversations, fleeting expressions of confusion, and moments of hesitation betrayed the fact that some of these individuals were unfamiliar with one another's supposed backgrounds. I cataloged every inconsistency, knowing that these small details would later provide invaluable leverage. Timing, as in every performance, is everything. As the evening progressed, I noticed the moments when Victoria's attention faltered, when her control slipped, even if just for a heartbeat. These were the moments to remember, the moments when truth peeked out from behind the curtain of pretense. She would pause mid-conversation, adjust her jewelry, or correct a server, all while maintaining the illusion of poise. But in these brief instances, her true character, a combination of arrogance, insecurity, and impatience, was laid bare. And I, ever watchful, stored each revelation meticulously. Another critical aspect of silent observation is restraint. There is a power in withholding intervention, in allowing events to unfold naturally while collecting information. Many would be tempted to confront or correct, but doing so prematurely would spoil the narrative, reveal intentions, or provoke defensive reactions. I remained patient, allowing Victoria to continue her performance, to reveal her own vulnerabilities without realizing they were being recorded. Every misstep, every subtle slight, every moment of overconfidence would later serve as a foundation for the story I intended to tell, an exposure so complete that it could not be denied. Technology, too, played a role in my observation. Smartphones, cameras, and the digital footprints left behind by her curated wedding moments became part of the evidence. I discreetly ensured that every photo, every video, every interaction was captured. It wasn't for public display yet. This was merely the preparation stage. I treated it as data collection, an archive of behavior that would later reveal the truth in undeniable clarity. Perhaps most importantly, I observed her interactions with me. Victoria had assumed that I would remain in the background, a benign presence with no influence over her day. This was a critical error on her part, and I noted it carefully. Every dismissive glance, every curt word, Every subtle attempt to assert superiority was evidence of her overconfidence. She had no idea that I was aware of the grand structure she was attempting to construct around herself, nor that I had already begun formulating the strategy that would eventually dismantle it entirely. The evening moved on, yet my role as silent observer remained constant. I navigated the room like a phantom, invisible to the untrained eye but fully present in perception. The beauty of this strategy is that it creates a tension, both for the observer and the observed. While Victoria performed her illusions for the guests, unaware of the scrutiny she was under, I collected an unbroken chain of insights that would later form the backbone of her exposure. It was the patience of a chess master, waiting for the opponent to make the first mistake, knowing that once the pieces began to fall, the outcome would be inevitable. By the time the first dance approached, I had a complete understanding of the dynamics at play. I knew the vulnerabilities, the inconsistencies, the cracks in the illusion. Silent observation had revealed everything Victoria believed she could hide: the discrepancies in her narrative, the artificiality of her curated social circle, and the arrogance that would ultimately lead to her undoing. And yet, I did nothing, choosing instead to remain invisible, a shadow moving quietly along the edges of her world, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The unraveling begins. The moment finally arrived when observation alone was no longer enough. Victoria's carefully constructed world of illusion, which she had meticulously curated for months, began to show the first cracks. It started with something so subtle that most guests didn't notice: a slip in her narrative, a hesitation in her speech, a forced laugh at a joke that held no humor. But to me, trained in reading between the lines, it was unmistakable. The facade was faltering, and the unraveling had begun. The first sign appeared during the toasts. Victoria had insisted on her family taking center stage, ensuring that their apparent wealth and sophistication dominated every speech and every interaction. Yet, as they began to speak, inconsistencies emerged. Words stumbled, names contradicted previous claims, and anecdotes that were supposed to demonstrate authenticity felt rehearsed and artificial. I could feel the tension beneath the polished smiles, and the guests' reactions were a mixture of polite interest and subtle confusion. Every misstep was a thread pulling at the seams of her grand illusion. Timing, as always, was crucial. I had spent the evening mapping every social interaction, and now I could begin the strategic phase: the unveiling of the truth. I chose my moments carefully, never rushing, never drawing attention prematurely. Victoria's arrogance gave her confidence that the threads of her deception were invisible. She believed she was untouchable, and that overconfidence was her greatest vulnerability. It allowed me to act decisively, using patience as a weapon far more powerful than confrontation. The first major slip came during a brief interaction with one of her supposed cousins. Their conversation, meant to demonstrate familial warmth, instead revealed a critical discrepancy. Names were forgotten, shared memories were vague, and references to family history were conspicuously absent. To the average guest, these might have seemed trivial, but to me it was evidence, proof that the family she had presented was not who they claimed to be. I quietly recorded every word, every facial expression, every pause. This moment was the first domino in a chain reaction that would ultimately expose the elaborate deception. Victoria, unaware of the scrutiny, continued to navigate the evening with an almost theatrical poise. But the cracks in her performance were widening, and even she could not control the subtle cues her body was giving away. Her smile occasionally faltered, her gestures were slightly off, and the intensity of her gaze occasionally revealed frustration and panic. These small tells, invisible to most, were a map of her unraveling composure. I made a mental note of each one, knowing that the cumulative effect would be devastating when revealed at the right moment. The pivotal turning point came during a seemingly innocuous moment: the cake-cutting ceremony. The photographers were focused entirely on the spectacle, capturing every angle of the lavishly decorated cake and the perfectly coordinated outfits. Yet, beneath the surface, the inconsistencies continued to mount. The people she had presented as family engaged in awkward small talk, their body language betraying discomfort, hesitation, and confusion. Some subtly exchanged glances that were either apologetic or questioning. Each of these micro-moments reinforced the growing realization that this was a carefully orchestrated performance, and not a genuine family gathering. I began to engage more directly, subtly introducing questions and observing the responses. These interactions were crafted not to reveal my intentions, but to let the truth emerge organically. I asked about family traditions, shared memories, and historical references. With each answer, the inconsistencies became more apparent. Details contradicted previous statements, timelines did not match, and the carefully constructed narrative Victoria had relied upon began to crumble. Her veneer of perfection was no longer sufficient to mask the inconsistencies, and I could sense the tension rising in her posture and expression. As the evening progressed, I could see the effect of these cracks on the guests. Social cues shifted subtly. Polite smiles were replaced with raised eyebrows, brief hesitations, and quiet whispers. Guests who had initially been captivated by the spectacle began to question the authenticity of what they were witnessing. Even the most oblivious attendees could sense that something was off, though they did not yet understand the full scope of the deception. This silent awareness among the crowd amplified the pressure on Victoria, accelerating the unraveling process. By this point, I had collected sufficient evidence to ensure that nothing could later be dismissed as coincidence. Every contradiction, every hesitation, every artificial gesture was documented meticulously in my mind and, when appropriate, through discreet technological means. The network of lies that Victoria had woven so carefully was beginning to resemble a fragile spiderweb, ready to collapse under the weight of scrutiny. I did not need to rush the moment. The unraveling had a rhythm of its own, and all I had to do was remain patient, precise, and vigilant. Victoria's panic began to manifest subtly but unmistakably. I noticed her voice growing slightly sharper when she addressed certain guests, her laughter more forced, her attempts to control interactions increasingly desperate. These reactions only confirmed what I already knew. The exposure was inevitable. Each carefully timed observation, each strategic question, and each unnoticed slip had successfully destabilized the structure she had relied upon to impress and intimidate. By the time the first dance was announced, the unraveling was well underway. Victoria, still attempting to maintain an aura of grace, was now visibly strained, aware on some subconscious level that her world was beginning to collapse. She was trapped in a performance of her own making, and every move she made only revealed further cracks. The silent observation that had carried the evening thus far had transitioned into an active phase. The exposure of truth was imminent, and the careful orchestration that had governed her deception was finally slipping beyond her control. The exposure escalates. The night had shifted. What began as subtle inconsistencies had grown into a momentum all their own, and by now, the exposure could no longer be contained. Victoria's polished veneer, so carefully cultivated, was beginning to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. The tension was palpable, and it wasn't just in her posture or forced smiles. The room itself seemed to sense the imbalance, the subtle anxiety that had begun to ripple outward from her increasingly frazzled composure. It was during the dinner service that the escalation became undeniable. The waitstaff, meticulously instructed in advance to maintain appearances, now faced subtle conflicts in the carefully orchestrated interactions. Plates were delivered slightly out of order, guests engaged in half-remembered introductions, and Victoria's family members occasionally misidentified each other. Each misstep was like a tremor, hinting at the larger truth. The meticulously crafted world she had insisted upon was beginning to collapse. Guests, who until now had been mesmerized by opulence and performance, began to exchange small, knowing glances. The first seeds of suspicion were planted, and they were growing faster than I had anticipated. I decided it was time to accelerate the exposure. Patience had allowed the cracks to form, but momentum was required to bring the facade down completely. I approached conversations strategically, embedding seemingly casual questions that probed for further inconsistencies. One query about shared family vacations resulted in conflicting accounts, and a simple mention of schooling led to an awkward pause that revealed more than words ever could. Each subtle trap was designed not to accuse but to allow truth to surface organically. The responses, hesitant and contradictory, spoke volumes. Victoria's reaction to the mounting inconsistencies was telling. She had always relied on charm and intimidation, but now her defense mechanisms were unraveling. A forced laugh here, a sharp retort there, small cracks that betrayed a growing panic. I could see her scanning the room, searching for an ally, a supportive nod, any indication that she was still in control. But by this point, her network of actors had become erratic themselves. Under pressure, they stumbled through rehearsed lines, misremembered their shared history, and exchanged subtle but revealing glances. Their discomfort amplified the sense of instability in the room. The pivotal escalation occurred when a guest, unaware of my orchestration, inadvertently exposed a key contradiction. A casual remark about Victoria's childhood triggered a response from one of her supposed relatives that directly contradicted what had been previously stated. The moment was brief, but it was explosive in its effect. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into quiet murmurs, whispered questions, and confused expressions. Victoria, caught mid-performance, froze, her carefully maintained poise slipping further with every passing second. At this stage, the unraveling became almost theatrical. I continued to weave my observations into casual interactions, each question designed to provoke subtle but revealing responses. When asked about family traditions, her relatives provided conflicting details. When inquired about childhood memories, timelines contradicted themselves. Even seemingly insignificant facts, favorite foods, hometown anecdotes, schooling details, failed to align. The web of deception that Victoria had spun was showing its fragility, and the guests, sensing the dissonance, began to question what they had been shown. Victoria's panic now manifested physically. Her gestures became abrupt, her attempts to steer conversations fell flat, and her laughter, once controlled and smooth, became erratic. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking validation, yet finding none. The realization that her facade was disintegrating visibly shook her, and her sense of control evaporated. Every misstep by her family compounded the effect, and with each faltering word, the illusion she had so meticulously constructed unraveled further. By the time the evening's entertainment began, the exposure had escalated beyond subtle whispers and polite confusion. Guests, once passive observers, now reacted openly. Questions were asked more boldly, interactions grew sharper, and the air was thick with unspoken skepticism. Victoria attempted to recover through charm and distraction, but the cracks had grown too wide. The collective intuition of the guests had detected the truth, even if they could not yet articulate it fully. The turning point of escalation occurred in a private but semi-public moment, an interaction captured by the photographer, whose lens inadvertently documented the unfolding truth. Victoria attempted to stage a congratulatory toast with one of her siblings, but the exchange collapsed under the weight of inconsistencies. Hesitations, contradictions, and fleeting expressions of panic were all caught in perfect clarity. The moment, though brief, would later serve as undeniable proof of the elaborate ruse. Every movement, every glance, every misplaced word contributed to the cumulative effect of exposure. I had anticipated this escalation and prepared accordingly. Each observation, each casual query, each unnoticed slip had been recorded and catalogued in my mind with precision. By allowing the exposure to grow naturally, I had ensured that Victoria's panic and the unraveling of her performance would appear authentic, undeniable, and irreversible. The strategy was not to confront in anger but to let truth illuminate itself, to allow the artifice to collapse under its own weight. By the end of the evening, the escalation had reached its zenith. Victoria's carefully curated world lay in tatters before an audience that had once been captivated by glamour and pretense. The tension that had been building subtly through the night had finally transformed into an overt recognition of deception. Guests who had initially applauded and admired were now silent, exchanging expressions that conveyed disbelief, skepticism, and subtle vindication. Victoria, once confident and untouchable, was now trapped in the very web of her own making, the exposure of her deception complete, yet elegantly orchestrated to reveal itself naturally. The confrontation, By the time the dessert course was served, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The whispers that had started as quiet murmurs were now impossible to ignore. Guests who had initially been charmed by Victoria's charm and the facade of opulence now exchanged glances heavy with suspicion. The tension in the air was almost tangible, a charged current running through every interaction, and it had reached the point where avoidance was no longer possible. The confrontation was inevitable. I had observed her carefully throughout the evening. The calculated gestures, the forced smiles, the subtle attempts to regain control. But with each failed interaction, her composure eroded further, leaving her vulnerable in ways that words alone could not conceal. I knew that a direct confrontation had to be precise, surgical even. It could not come across as an attack but as a revelation, a logical unfolding of truths the guests had already begun to suspect. Timing, tone, and method were critical. I approached her at a moment when she was attempting to regain dominance, addressing the guests with an overly rehearsed story about her family heritage. The room's energy was fractured, and even her closest actors faltered slightly under the mounting scrutiny. I began with subtle observations, stating what anyone could see: inconsistencies, contradictions, and moments that did not add up. Her eyes flickered nervously, searching for allies, but the gaps in her support network had become too obvious. One by one, her family members avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. I didn't need to accuse. The confrontation relied on letting the truth speak for itself. I asked questions that seemed innocuous but were impossible to answer convincingly. Where had certain events happened? Who had attended specific celebrations? How could timelines align with the accounts previously given? Each question exposed more cracks. Victoria's carefully rehearsed responses became hurried, fragmented, and ultimately contradictory. The room, which had been a stage for performance, transformed into a crucible of revelation. Guests began to react. Initially subtle, their expressions quickly evolved into open skepticism. Whispers grew louder, curious glances multiplied, and the atmosphere became electric with anticipation. Some guests tried to piece together the inconsistencies themselves, asking follow-up questions, gently pressing for clarity. Others observed silently, the shift from passive admiration to active investigation creating a collective awareness. Victoria's panic was visible in her rigid posture, her rapid gestures, and the occasional nervous laugh that rang hollow. The confrontation escalated when one of the guests, unprompted and unaware of the orchestration, pointed out a glaring inconsistency. It was a minor detail, something about a supposedly shared childhood memory, but it was enough to break the fragile illusion. Victoria's response was defensive, clipped, and visibly strained. Her family members flinched, caught between loyalty to the facade and the undeniable truth emerging in front of them. The room seemed to shrink, focused entirely on this unraveling performance. I continued to probe gently but persistently, carefully balancing directness with subtlety. I narrated observed contradictions, each carefully recorded in my mind, and contrasted them with her earlier statements. The effect was cumulative, building a narrative that no amount of charm or intimidation could counter. Victoria's voice quivered slightly. She attempted diversion, laughter, and charm, but the room's collective awareness had shifted irrevocably. Each failed attempt at control made the confrontation sharper, more undeniable, more dramatic. Then came the moment that changed everything: the public revelation. I addressed a discrepancy involving her parents, a critical component of the illusion. Their absence from key interactions, coupled with conflicting stories, exposed the fundamental lie of her entire performance. Victoria's expression shifted from nervous composure to open alarm. She faltered, stumbling through her words as the reality of her exposure became unavoidable. The room fell silent, the collective attention now riveted on her unraveling. The confrontation was no longer subtle. It was now a spectacle of truth against pretense. Each of her misstatements, each contradictory response, became a confirmation for the guests. The actors around her, once confident and polished, now appeared hesitant, uncertain, and increasingly unable to maintain the illusion. Their discomfort amplified the confrontation, creating a domino effect of revelation that Victoria could neither control nor stop. I paused, letting the tension reach its peak. The guests absorbed the evidence organically, piecing together inconsistencies into a coherent understanding. No loud accusations were needed. The confrontation relied on the natural flow of truth, allowing everyone present to witness the collapse of a carefully constructed facade. Victoria's attempts to regain authority were futile. Each statement she made now only reinforced the reality of deception. Finally, I addressed the culmination of all observations, stating the inconsistencies clearly and publicly. This was not a declaration of victory but a methodical, undeniable presentation of facts. The room, once a stage for illusion, now resonated with clarity. The confrontation had achieved its purpose. The truth was evident, and no charm, wealth, or pretense could reverse it. Victoria's world, so carefully curated, lay exposed before everyone present. By the end of the evening, the confrontation had fundamentally shifted the narrative. What had begun as a private conflict had become a public revelation, witnessed by friends, family, and strangers alike. The power dynamic had reversed. Victoria's authority, once unquestioned, was now undermined. The confrontation, orchestrated but appearing organic, had successfully illuminated the truth. Guests departed with their perceptions forever altered, having witnessed the unraveling of a deception so meticulously constructed that it had initially seemed unassailable. The aftermath and fallout. The wedding, once filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and carefully orchestrated charm, had transformed into a night of uneasy murmurs and stunned silence. By the time the guests began to disperse, the energy in the room was heavy, charged with a mix of disbelief, vindication, and quiet satisfaction. The confrontation had changed everything, and there was no returning to the carefully curated illusion that Victoria and her entourage had tried to present. What followed was the fallout, subtle yet profound, shaping not only the immediate atmosphere but the relationships, reputations, and emotional landscapes of everyone involved. As the last guests filed out, I watched reactions unfold in real time. Some approached me quietly, expressing relief or admiration for handling the situation with precision and composure. Others lingered, eyes darting toward Victoria, clearly processing the enormity of what had occurred. The air was thick with questions, whispers, and a collective need for clarity. Even those who had been neutral observers now had a story to recount, an unforgettable experience that would shape their memories of the event for years to come. Victoria, on the other hand, had retreated to a corner, flustered and visibly shaken. Her usual air of superiority and control was gone, replaced by a mixture of shame, anger, and disbelief. Her attempts to salvage her dignity were futile. Every movement, every glance, betrayed the unraveling of a persona built on carefully constructed lies. The hired actors, her supposed family, were similarly disoriented, caught between loyalty to their client and the undeniable truth that had been laid bare before a room full of witnesses. Their discomfort only amplified the sense of collapse surrounding her. The immediate fallout was emotional. Victoria lashed out, first quietly, then more openly, in ways that revealed her desperation. Accusations, excuses, and fleeting attempts to shift blame flew like sparks in a confined space. Each one met with quiet skepticism from those who had witnessed the confrontation. Her attempts at self-preservation, once calculated and polished, now appeared clumsy and transparent. The disparity between perception and reality had become irreconcilable, leaving her isolated in a way that no wealth, status, or charm could remedy. Beyond the room, the ripple effects were significant. Guests began sharing their experiences, recounting the inconsistencies and contradictions they had observed. Stories spread rapidly, first in hushed tones and then more openly, creating a web of social proof that further dismantled Victoria's fabricated identity. Each retelling reinforced the exposure of her deception, embedding the truth in the collective memory of those present. By morning, the narrative had already solidified. The illusion had failed, and the reality could not be denied. On a personal level, the aftermath offered a complex mixture of relief and reflection. Relief that the confrontation had been executed with clarity and precision, that truth had prevailed over deception. Reflection on the layers of manipulation and performance that had been meticulously maintained and ultimately dismantled in a single evening. The experience reinforced the importance of observation, patience, and careful strategy in moments where appearances and reality clash. It also reminded me that courage and composure, when combined with evidence and clarity, could have transformative effects in high-stakes situations. Victoria's personal fallout was swift and unrelenting. Her credibility among the guests was irrevocably damaged. Relationships she had relied on, even superficially, began to fray. Allies became cautious, recognizing the fragility of her persona and the consequences of association. Social and emotional isolation followed, a natural consequence of the exposure of her true character. The facade of wealth and sophistication that had initially commanded respect now elicited skepticism and, in some cases, outright contempt. For the wedding itself, the fallout reshaped the narrative entirely. What was meant to be a celebration of love and unity had become a cautionary tale about deception, pretension, and authenticity. Guests left not with memories of elegance or grandeur, but with a story of exposure, a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that truth has a way of emerging, no matter how deeply it is buried. In the days and weeks that followed, the wedding would be discussed not for its beauty or ceremony, but for the confrontation and the unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. Yet, amid the fallout, there was also a sense of empowerment. The revelation of truth brought clarity, justice, and closure. It reinforced the value of integrity, resilience, and careful discernment in navigating complex social landscapes. The guests, now armed with first-hand experience of deception and exposure, carried forward not only the shock of the event, but also the lessons it imparted about perception, trust, and the consequences of dishonesty. In the end, the aftermath was both destructive and instructive. Victoria's carefully constructed world had crumbled, her ambitions and image laid bare for all to see. The guests had witnessed a transformation, a confrontation that began quietly and methodically but ended in undeniable revelation. And I, having orchestrated the exposure with precision and calm, had navigated the storm of deception to achieve clarity and justice. The night, once meant to celebrate union, had instead become a powerful testament to the enduring strength of truth and the inevitable collapse of pretense. As the last lights dimmed and the room emptied, the echoes of that confrontation lingered, a lasting reminder that authenticity cannot be faked indefinitely. The aftermath was more than a conclusion. It was a revelation, a lesson, and a turning point that would shape perceptions, relationships, and reputations long after the wedding had ended. Victoria's world had fallen, but from the ruins emerged clarity, justice, and the undeniable triumph of truth over illusion.